Alright, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something pretty wild. We're going to look at how a single, deeply traumatic event essentially kicked off Rome's villain arc, turning them into an unstoppable superpower. A superpower that, ironically, was ultimately destroyed by its very own military machine. You know, we usually think of Rome as this inevitable, eternal empire, right? But its rise, it wasn't just about geography or ambition. It was deeply, deeply psychological. So how exactly does a vulnerable little city level up to become the ancient world's final boss? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at the exact moment Rome's psychology just snapped. Because if you really want to understand why Rome conquered the known world, you've got to understand the time they lost. And I mean lost badly. Picture this. Long before the shiny marble emperors we all know, Rome was attacked by the Gauls. And the Gauls didn't just win a battle. They basically marched right in, looted the place, burned most of it to the ground, and then, get this, just sat around treating the smoking ruins like a casual weekend camping trip. Seriously. They only agreed to pack up and leave after humiliating the Romans into paying this massive ransom in gold. This catastrophe, it birthed a dark, totally unshakable psychological mandate for the Roman psyche. Never again. This right here, this was the origin story of their entire villain arc. And what's super fascinating is just how quickly this trauma sparked a massive, hyper-militaristic expansion. Rome basically decided that the absolute only way to avoid ever being humiliated like that again was to make sure literally no one else was strong enough to threaten them. So they went on the offensive. They systematically started absorbing every neighboring tribe and colony. First it was their Latin neighbors, then the hill tribes, then the Greek colonies down south. Basically, if you lived anywhere near Rome, you were getting absorbed. Period. Part 2. Deleting the rivals. As you can imagine, Rome's aggressive expansion eventually slammed into a brick wall across the water in Carthage. Carthage was literally everything Rome couldn't stand. Incredibly rich, powerful, and rocking this massive state-of-the-art navy. This rivalry sparked the Punic Wars. Think of it as 3 blockbuster sequels of absolute chaos. In the first war, Rome adapted by flat-out stealing Carthaginian ship designs so they could reverse engineer their own winning navy. In the second, they faced Hannibal, the guy who famously marched 50,000 troops and 37 actual elephants over the freezing Alps just to wreck Roman territory. Rome barely survived that one. And honestly, that near-death experience led to a pretty ruthless final conclusion in the Third War. This moment brilliantly illustrates the absolute peak of their villain arc. Rome didn't just defeat Carthage. Oh no. They entirely leveled the city to the ground and enslaved whoever survived. They completely, utterly deleted their greatest rival from the timeline, just to guarantee with absolute certainty that they would never, ever be threatened from the south again. So, with their main rival out of the picture, Rome essentially became addicted to expansion. It's like, instead of dealing with their foundational trauma, they just acted out on a global scale. Fueled by what was basically a 330-year-old grudge, they conquered a staggering 10% of all humanity. They enslaved entire civilizations across Spain, Greece, and, ironically, Gaul, the very place that had traumatized them centuries earlier. You've got generals like Julius Caesar completely dismantling whole regions, mutating Rome into this sprawling, unstoppable behemoth. Which brings us to the next phase, the professional war machine. Now, all of this unchecked expansion and insane power accumulation actually broke the Roman Republic. It just couldn't handle the weight. So the first emperor, Augustus, steps in to completely systemize Roman power. He took a hard look at things and diagnosed the Republic's fatal flaw. The armies had become loyal to individual men, not the state itself. Soldiers were literally just fighting for whichever rogue general promised them the biggest bag of loot. Augustus realized, okay, I have to shift that loyalty directly back to the government, or we're doomed. He pulled this off by creating what we can call the Augustan package. He took the army and transformed it into a permanent professional standing force. No more ragtag temporary militias. By offering a predictable 20-year career, standardized pay, and state-backed retirement land grants to roughly 150,000 troops, Augustus basically pulled a masterstroke. He removed the primary fuel that was causing all those civil wars. At the same time, he dramatically shifted their overall military strategy. He slammed the brakes on endless expansion and pivoted to hardcore defense. He locked down the borders along the Rhine and Danube rivers. And crucially, this is super smart, he deliberately separated the provinces that had a lot of money from the provinces that had a lot of soldiers. Tossing a rule to constantly rotate generals, and boom, he ensured that no single person could ever hoard enough resources and manpower to threaten the capital again. But, of course, things didn't stay stable forever. Section 4. When soldiers become rulers. Look, on paper, it was a genius system that brought unprecedented stability. But, unfortunately, the very military structure Augustus designed to protect everything eventually turned inward. Central to this disaster was the Praetorian Guard. Originally, they were just an elite protective unit, basically the emperor's secret service. But when Augustus' successor, Emperor Tiberius, decided he hated public life and went off to isolate himself on a remote island, the commander of this heavily armed guard, who was still stationed right there in Rome, suddenly became the ultimate gatekeeper of imperial power. And that sparked a genuinely terrifying cycle of institutional rot. The guard quickly realized something pretty obvious. Wait, we're the ones holding all the swords, and we're standing right next to the emperor. We actually hold the real power. So they murdered Emperor Caligula and literally handpicked his uncle Claudius to take his place. That set a brand new, very dangerous precedent. Power no longer flowed from tradition, or the Senate, or the people. It flowed straight from the soldiers. This military rot just festered in the background until the death of Emperor Nero in 68 AD. Which brings us to a highly specific and honestly incredibly disastrous number. 69 AD, the year the entire empire essentially descended into a chaotic free-for-all, famously known as the Year of the Four Emperors. In the span of a single year, 4 completely different men violently claimed the throne. Why? Well, because those massively powerful border armies that Augustus had created to protect the empire looked at the Praetorian Guard and thought, hey, we can do that too. They realized they could just march on Rome and install their own preferred candidates by brute force. Now, somehow, the empire survived that year. But from then on, the military held the leash. Always. And the absolute jaw-dropping absurdity of this military rule hits its peak exactly here, in the year 193 AD. I mean, you can't make this up. The systemic rot was so complete by this point that the Praetorian Guard literally put the Roman Empire up for auction. They sold it off to the highest bidder like it was a used chariot. They sold the title of emperor for cold hard cash to a wildly wealthy guy named Julianus. And how did that work out for him? He got to reign for exactly 66 days before another general marched into town and executed him. The civilian institutions were completely, totally dead at this point. Only force mattered. Which leads us to our final section, destroyed by the system. Obviously, a military infrastructure this broken couldn't hold the weight of the world forever. The final fatal collapse actually started with a massive refugee crisis. Tens of thousands of Goths, who were fleeing the genuinely terrifying Huns, showed up right at the Roman border begging for asylum. Rome agreed to let them in, which honestly might have been manageable, but deeply corrupt Roman officials exploited and starved these refugees so badly that a massive, totally desperate revolt sparked from right inside the empire's own borders. And that powder keg exploded at the Battle of Adrianople. The Goths completely obliterated a Roman army and actually killed the reigning emperor right there on the battlefield. After a catastrophe like that, Rome completely lost its leverage. They fell into this fatal, bleeding trap of constantly giving away huge chunks of land to armed groups just to bribe them to stop burning down their cities. Eventually, the Vandals swept in and captured North Africa. And once Rome lost North Africa, which was basically their primary grain and tax supply, someone essentially just cut the empire's throat. Because the Roman state was so incredibly weakened and corrupt by this point, they had zero ability to control or integrate the massive populations pouring in. They weren't making new Roman citizens anymore. As the saying goes, they were just importing their own future civil wars. So stripped of resources, completely broke, and lacking reliable soldiers, Rome was finally subjected to the exact nightmare they had spent 800 years trying to avoid: total humiliation. They were repeatedly sacked, first by the Visigoths in 410, then by the Vandals in 455, and finally, in 476 AD, a Germanic commander just casually walked up to the very last Western emperor, a kid ironically named Romulus Augustulus, and politely asked him to step down. He did, and just like that, without some massive final battle, the Western Roman state quietly died. I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on today. Rome's obsessive, trauma-induced need for absolute military dominance was the exact thing that built the structures guaranteeing its spectacular downfall. The army built to protect the state ended up turning around and eating it. So, what does that tell us about the heavily militarized superpowers of today? Can any empire truly outlast its own villain arc? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the history right in front of you.